Hello, this is the retest for the development unit. So if you are watching this, hopefully it is Thursday and you are getting yourself ready to retake that test on Friday. Just to give you the heads up, I will have it available when you are ready to log into the RTI or retesting for development. You will log into it. It is going to be timed, so you do not have all day to take the test. So keep that in mind when you decide you're ready to retake it. Retake it during school hours during Friday, so I can go ahead and get them scored and hopefully update your test score to a little higher score. So what are you going to need to know for this particular test? There's a couple of big things that you're going to need to remember. No big surprise, the raw style model is going to appear on the RTI test here. So you're going to need to remember, what does the raw style model tell you? There's 5 steps to it. Step 1 or stage 1 is traditional society, and that is a society in which virtually everybody is a farmer. There's very few people that live in cities. Whatever items are finished goods or handcrafted cottage industry stuff. But the vast majority of people are working on farms, and that's what they do for a living. Stage 2 is what they call pre-takeoff. These are the things that need to be in place before a country can begin the industrial process. So this is like road building, building water systems, sewage systems are probably part of this as well. So that sort of infrastructure stuff is stage 2. That stuff gets built. And usually it is economic elites in that country that are building this stuff because they want to have more access to things from other regions of the country or regions of the world. So they build transportation systems and stuff like that. Stage 3 is takeoff. Takeoff is industrialization has begun. And we begin to start opening up factories, and they're usually basic industries first. Things like textiles. You're going to start making cloth. So think about the early stages of the Industrial Revolution in Europe. Places like England, one of the very first things that is mechanized is the textile industry. They start making cloth. And when you start opening up those factories, you're probably going to locate them in cities. And when you locate them in the cities, that's going to start drawing people off the farms to move into the cities to start working those industrial jobs. So this is where we begin to see urbanization take place in the raw style model. People start moving into the cities at this point. After that has gone on for a while, we can classify a country as a developing country. It's beginning to develop industries. At stage 4, it is sometimes referred to as the drive to modernity, to the modern world. And you're going to move away from basic industries like textiles, and you're going to start moving into producing big, heavy machinery and stuff, things often for other industries. So think about building railroads and stuff like that. That's kind of a sign that you've moved into the drive to the modern world. But you're going to be producing big, heavy equipment for industrial use for the most part. You're going to build up a steel industry, things like that. At stage 5, it is referred to as the stage of modern consumption or mass consumption. And at this point, you start moving away from producing stuff in factories for other industries, and you start moving into making stuff for common citizens. So you start making toaster ovens, and you start making ovens and refrigerators and personal cars and stuff like that. When you've reached stage 5, you are considered industrialized. And in those previous ones from 3, 4, and 5, you're going to be drawing people into the cities to go work in those factories. And so, again, that's the stages that have an urbanization end to them. Once you've achieved stage 5, you are considered industrialized. Most of your people are probably living in cities at that point, and they're doing some sort of either industrial work or they're starting to move into service sector stuff, professional jobs and things like that. But when Rostow was doing his thing, he was just looking at developing countries. What is the arc that happens stage 1 through 5 from going from a completely non-industrial country to what we would consider industrialized. And think about how that relates to the ETM and the DTM too, because those all kind of overlap if you start looking at them. Other things that you're going to need to know: levels of economic activity. What are people doing at different levels of development? So if you are looking at primary economic activity, you're looking at farming, you're looking at mining, you're looking at being a fisherman. So at primary economic activity, you're doing some sort of either collecting raw materials or you're collecting food. So you're farming, you're a coal miner, you are a deep sea fisherman or something like that. You are drilling the surface to extract oil or something. Anything that is dealing with a raw material or dealing with raw food is going to be considered a primary economic activity. And most people, if you look at human history, that's what they were doing through most of human history. It was primary. Secondary, you are starting to take stuff and turn it into finished goods within a factory setting. So you're taking all that iron ore and the rubber and the raw silica to make glass, and you're turning that into a car. The car is the finished product, and it's made in a factory. So if you were taking raw materials and turning it into a finished product, that job that you're doing is considered secondary. You're manufacturing things. So that could be anybody working in a factory. It could be that you're taking raw food and you're putting it in cans. So somebody, oh, there goes the lights. If somebody is working in a tuna canning factory, they would be considered secondary because they're taking the food and they're putting it into a finished product, which is a can of tuna. Anybody that was making breakfast cereal would be considered secondary because we're turning all that corn and wheat and sugar and whatever and turning it into, Post Toasties or Fruit Loops or whatever it is. So you've manufactured something and you have made it ready for somebody to buy as a finished good. Okay. The other people that fit it secondary are people that transport these goods or the raw materials. So a train engineer that is a freight train engineer pulling a whole bunch of coal and boxes of stuff would be considered secondary. A pilot that is flying frozen lobsters or whatever would be considered secondary as well. So if you're moving the goods or if you're manufacturing the goods, you're secondary. Tertiary is you're either selling goods or you're selling services. So our tuna, our car, our whatever it is that we manufactured is now going to go to somebody who sells it to the public. So this is where money changes hands and somebody buys a good. The salesman is the tertiary person here. They sell the good or they're providing the service. So anybody that works in a shopping mall would be probably considered tertiary. Lawyers, teachers, anybody that has a professional thing that they offer as a service, either educating or legal advice or doing your books or whatever, that sort of thing, that's a service, and it also is considered tertiary. Also in this is anybody that transports humans. So airline pilots or a train engineer that is now a passenger train, that's going to be a personal service to somebody. You're helping them go from one place to another. It's considered tertiary. So anybody in the sales field, anybody that is just providing professional skills would be considered tertiary. Quaternary is the realm of mad scientists. So this is the realm of new ideas. So people that write new software programs for computers. That's something new, something that hasn't been done before, and therefore is considered quaternary. It is the realm of new stuff. Research medicine, research chemistry, robotics. If you're on the cutting edge of any sort of science or technology, you probably fit into the quaternary sciences. You're exploring the new. And so you'll have quite an eclectic bunch of people here, but it could be new medical technologies. It could be all sorts of stuff. But if it is a new idea, if we've not seen it before, then that is the realm of quaternary economic activity, which includes, by the way, artists, painters, sculptors, poets, people that write fiction books, anybody that's dealing with a new idea, creating something new, also fits into quaternary, which leaves us quaternary or quinary. Quinary is the realm of management. And these are people whose job it is to make decisions which impact thousands, if not millions, or perhaps even billions of lives on a day-to-day basis. They're the big decision makers. So think about government officials, presidents, members of legislatures and stuff. Think about the Pope. The Pope is somebody that influences billions of people around the world. So anybody that has that kind of influence, where they're making decisions that impact lots and lots of different people, are going to fit into the realm or the level of management or decision making, which is quinary. So far, so good. Yay. A couple of other things you're going to need to probably focus on. We're looking at developing countries again, so you've got to look at the two different models that countries may adopt as the way that they're going to develop their country. One is the self-sufficiency model. You're going to use your own resources. You're going to invest in yourself to try to build up your country to where your economic system begins to change and grow. This is positive in the sense that you're not going to be dependent on anybody else. You're going to make, as a government, probably the decisions of where you want to invest in. And so you can invest in lots of different fields of economic activity. So lots of your people may be lifted up economically as you invest in different economic sectors within your economy. It also means that you probably are going to try to protect these new industries. So if you have an industry that is developing television sets and building television sets, you probably don't want to compete with the South Koreans and the Japanese and the Chinese immediately. So you'll put up tariffs and stuff to keep their stuff out of your country so your locals can buy locally first. And that's going to help your local companies thrive and expand and employ new people and build up your own economy. The problem with self-sufficiency is you may not have all the resources that you need to develop. If you want to develop a steel industry, you're going to kind of need coal and iron ore and stuff. And if you don't have that, you're going to have to import it, which probably isn't going to make a whole lot of sense anyway. So you're limited to whatever resources that you have to build your economy. It also means that it's probably not going to grow very fast. If you don't have that enough investment, and developing countries tend to be on the poor end of countries, they're not going to have a whole lot of money to invest in things. And so your economy may grow relatively slowly. It also means that you're probably going to be looking at nationalizing industries that will now be governed by the state itself or the government. In order to protect that or to have that sort of direct investment by the government to develop that industry. And sometimes that leads to very slow or sometimes no development whatsoever in that field. It fails to innovate because it's a state industry. So that's another downside. The other way that you might go is the international trade model, which is you're going to trade with the outside world. You're going to encourage investment in your country from the outside world. And so the big positive here is you're going to get a lot of investment from the outside world who maybe needs your resources. They want to build factories in your country. That's a lot of money coming into your country. And so that's a positive. So often countries that are on the international trade model will grow faster economically than the ones that are trying to do it themselves. The downside is that's all somebody else's money. And so it may well be that you're having to take out loans to get this kind of investment. It could be that whatever's invested in your country, now you don't really control that anymore. It's whoever spent that money to build up that industry. That's their industry, not yours. And also, they tend to invest in the things that they're going to make the most money off of first. And so your investment in your country may be very spotty. Some industries get a lot of outside investment and some do not, which means that your people are not equally thriving either. There are some that may benefit from all this in outside investment and others do not. So you have uneven development across your country when you go with the international trade model. You're also going to be competing with everybody else's goods too. And that may make it very difficult for your local industries to survive competing against Singapore, the United States, or the Germans, or whoever else who may have been doing this industry for a very, very long time. It's going to be tough to beat them in that market. One of the things you sometimes see with countries that adopt the international trade model is that they become an area of outsourcing or offshoring. And what we're looking here is as a country begins to trade with the outside world, companies outside that country will see that they can probably hire people at a lot less cost in a developing country than at home. And so they'll start moving their factories to that country because that country has lower labor costs. It's going to cost them less money to make products in that country. That is how China, for instance, turned its economy around and became the exporting nation that it is today. It had very low labor costs, and so a lot of factories move overseas. That's known as offshoring. It could be that they move other jobs as well, like skilled technical jobs. That's known as outsourcing. And so you have people employed overseas that are doing technical work like engineering or call centers or something to where you need a particular set of skills, but the labor costs are much cheaper in that country. India is a pretty good example of a country that when it adopted the international trade model, that a lot of jobs were outsourced to India because they required English language skills, and India had a lot of people that spoke English. So keep those in mind. Those might come up. Speaking of, when we were looking at labor costs and stuff, there's two terms you're probably going to need to know, and that is value added and productivity. Value added is the cost or the price of a good minus the value of the raw materials it took to make that good, plus the energy cost to make that good. So, if the price of the price of the item is $100, and you have $20 worth of raw materials to make it, and you have another $10 of electric cost, let's say, to make that thing, then the remaining amount is your profit margin that you would see just as far as value added to it. So that's the value that you've added to these raw materials and the power cost to decide what the price of the good is. The other thing that you might need to know is productivity, and productivity is the amount of labor cost it takes to make that item. And so if you included value added plus labor, whatever is left over price-wise, that's your profit margin on that item. So keep that in mind. The last thing that you probably need to pay attention to is global finance. When we're looking at global finance, we're looking at the World Bank. World Bank was set up after World War II to help countries recover from World War II, to invest in their industries and rebuild it. So its initial focus was on European or Asian countries that had been destroyed during the war. It also went to a lot of Latin American countries, which were already independent at this point. So the World Bank invested in developing those countries, which is one of the reasons why Latin America is a little further along the development run than let's say Africa or most of Asia, because they got early investment from the World Bank. The primary purpose of the World Bank was actually to make the world not become communists, because they were afraid that in these economically devastated areas of Europe and Asia that communism would sound pretty good. And so they wanted to get those industries built back up and employ people, and so people would not be so tempted to go to the communist model. Part of what the World Bank is the lending part, which they will lend to governments or particular industries to build up infrastructure or build up industries. That was not much offered, though, to developing countries like African countries or Asian countries, because most of those were colonies after World War II. So they tended to get their financing through another branch of the World Bank, which dealt specifically with what they called risk. That these countries are considered risky economic investments. And so you could, as a country, go to these development banks within the World Bank and get your loans to build infrastructure or build out industries, but at a higher cost. And so a lot of developing countries ended up in trouble debt-wise because they took out a lot of loans to build up their local economies, and then they did not have the means to actually pay all that money back, which is where we introduce you to the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, which deals with countries that have gotten themselves into debt problems. And so they will come in and institute often austerity programs that they cut back government spending and make sure that the money that the government is collecting is going to debt payoff. And so this is very unpopular in many parts of the world because people like their government services. And so if government services are getting cut back, that often makes the population unhappy. And so in parts of the world where the IMF has stepped in to kind of restore the creditworthiness of countries, often the local populations have very, very bad attitudes towards the IMF because their pensions got cut. There's fewer police force on the streets. The teachers don't get paid as much, or there's not as many teachers because they had to fire so many of them in order to cut back on government spending. There is another group that deals with investment in the developing world, and these are the microbanks and the micro lending. And this took an idea that when they looked at how investment was done in the developing world, it was always given to big companies or big governments. And these governments and these companies didn't seem to really spend the money particularly well. And so one of the thoughts was, well, why don't we give it to the people who actually need it the most and potentially would have the best use for it, which was the poor. And so the idea is that you would loan poor folk a very small loan in order to get their own cottage industry or whatever it is that they wanted to do up and running. Most of these loans are less than $100. And what happens is those folks they submit a proposal of what kind of business they want to do, how they're going to use the money. It's approved. Let's say that it's a good idea. And if I wanted to be a potter, let's say, in a developing country in Africa, I could get my loan, let's say $100. I use that to build a kiln so I can fire my pots. I get the right kind of clay. That's going to cost me some. I need a potter's wheel, potter's tools. I can probably get that used somewhere. So I'm probably not going to spend the whole $100. I make my first pots. I fire them. I sell them in the marketplace. I've made money. I take a little bit of that money, pay part of my loan back, buy more materials, make more pots, sell more pots in the marketplace, make more money, pay a little off on my loan, buy more stuff, and the whole process starts over and over and over again until I've paid off my loan, which I'm probably going to be able to do in a very short amount of time, probably less than a year. And at this point, I have my own business going. I am supporting myself. I'm supporting my family. And this is how you can grow economies, by helping the people at the very bottom best and first. The people that are most affected by this are female. Most of the loans go to women because they are the most desperate for that sort of investment, and they seem to have a really good idea of how to spend it in the environment that they are in, what kind of businesses are going to be successful. And it allows them to have autonomy, that they're no longer dependent on men to be able to support themselves. They're making their own money so they can support themselves and their children. They don't need a man more around to provide them that money. And so that makes social change. It makes gender relations different in the developing world. And so this is actually going to raise up their HDI, because part of what factors into the HDI and stuff is the quality of life of men and women. And so if you're improving the status of women by doing these kinds of loans, that's going to overall make the entire economy grow, for one, and it will improve the status of women within your society. Sometimes men are not really hip on that idea. I'm okay with it personally. The last thing that you might want to think about is what's the difference between MDCs and LDCs. MDCs are more developed countries. These are our industrialized or post-industrial societies. So when we're looking at MDCs, we're looking like Western Europe. We're talking about the United States. We're talking about Japan. Most of your MDCs are going to be in the Northern Hemisphere somewhere. The one exception is Australia, and recently we would look at maybe South Africa, maybe, as being considered an MDC. More than likely, South Africa fits into what we call the BRIC nations, which are those semi-periphery, just recently industrialized countries like Russia, China, Brazil. South Africa fits into this. Argentina probably fits into this. Mexico probably fits into this. Those that have just achieved that industrial state and now they're moving into service sector industries and stuff. That's different than the LDCs, which are less developed countries. And these are what we would recognize as developing countries. Most of Latin America, almost all of Africa, especially sub-Saharan Africa, much of Asia would still be considered LDCs or less developed countries. These are somewhere in the process of becoming an industrialized country, but they have not quite reached that state yet on the raw style model of stage 5. There's somewhere between 2 and 4 somewhere. The least developed of the countries, the LDCs that are least developed would be found in sub-Saharan Africa. So think about your Botswanas, your Gaboons, your Ghanas, and places like that are going to be on the low end of the LDC scale because they have developed least. That's not necessarily their fault. They have been under colonial control up until fairly recently, so they got to the Industrial Revolution late. They also suffer things like tropical disease, low levels of education. All of these things are factors that hold back sub-Saharan Africa from developing perhaps as fast as it really should. Africa itself is a very wealthy continent, and so these countries really should be wealthy and very far along the industrial run, but they're not. And part of that goes back to their history of being colonies. Part of it has to do with the environment itself, the presence of tropical disease, and how that impacts labor. Also, the fact that often we have very low levels of education, and it's very difficult to do professional jobs, more difficult jobs, if you don't have that education to do that. So keep all that in mind. You will be testing out on Friday. You will be home doing this. As it turns out, when we were doing this initial plan, we didn't think about that. So I'm going to have the test available Friday. You can take it when you are ready. Please try to take it before the end of the school day, because I'd like to be able to jump in there and get the test grades changed as rapidly as possible. But it'll be there. Once you enter it, the timer begins. So you must get it done before the timer ends. I wish you luck on Friday. I will unfortunately not be there to ask questions because I'm going to be in a bunch of meetings. So there's that. But I will try to get you updated as fast as I possibly can. Good luck.